Before leaving, he opened a kitchen drawer and removed an old leather notebook. The first few pages were filled with names from cases long closed. The final pages were blank. Walter slipped the notebook into his pocket. St. Luke's Church had been cleared by the time Walter arrived. 2 deputy vehicles blocked the parking lot. Yellow tape stretched across the main entrance. Daniel met Walter beneath the stone archway. At 52, Daniel Cole was younger than Walter by 17 years, though the last decade had begun to narrow the difference. Daniel had a square face, tired blue eyes, and the posture of a man who had spent too many years carrying responsibility for other people's mistakes. "You look terrible," Walter said. "I was at a funeral." "That explains the suit, not the face." Daniel handed him a pair of gloves. Inside the church, the coffin remained open. The dead man wore a dark gray suit. His face and hands showed severe burns, but the body itself had been protected enough to preserve identifying features. Walter stood beside the coffin and studied him quietly. "Who identified Richard after the crash?" he asked. Deputy Harris attended the scene. The medical examiner received the body that night. Identification was based on the wallet, ring, watch, and dental records supplied by the family dentist. "Dental records?" Daniel nodded. "Preliminary match?" "Preliminary isn't a word you want at a funeral." Walter looked at the dead man's left hand. A gold wedding band remained around one finger. He touched it gently. The ring moved. Walter frowned. "It's loose? Burn damage?" "Possibly." He lifted the hand slightly. There was no pale line beneath the ring. No indentation from years of wear. This man didn't wear it long. Daniel leaned closer. "You think it was placed on him?" "I think wedding rings leave evidence." Walter examined the wristwatch. An expensive silver timepiece. The clasp had been fastened over burned skin. Again, there was no mark beneath it. Same with the watch. Daniel stared at the body. Someone dressed him as Richard Bell. Or Richard dressed him as Richard Bell. Daniel looked at Walter. "You think Bell staged his death?" "I think we have a body wearing another man's belongings. Anything beyond that is an invitation to make a mistake." A young deputy entered the church. "Sheriff, what is it?" "We just heard from Greyford Community Bank. Richard Bell's company card was used at an ATM this morning." Daniel turned. "What time?" 6:43. The funeral had been scheduled for 10. "Camera?" Daniel asked. "They have footage." Walter looked down at the dead man. Daniel said quietly, "Richard Bell was alive 3 hours before his own funeral." Walter closed the coffin. "Then we should find out who came to watch him get buried." The Bell family was waiting inside the church meeting room. Helen Bell sat at the end of a long table, still wearing her black funeral dress. She was 55, elegant, controlled, and pale beneath carefully applied makeup. Beside her sat Laura Bell, Richard's 31-year-old daughter. Laura wore no makeup at all. Her red hair was tied behind her head, and she had spent most of the morning staring at the floor. Thomas Bell stood near the window. At 51, he was 7 years younger than Richard and looked nothing like him. Thomas was shorter, heavier, and carried himself with the permanent tension of someone accustomed to waiting for permission. Margaret Bell sat alone. She did not appear frightened. She appeared angry. Daniel began the questioning. "When was the last time each of you saw Richard alive?" Helen answered first. "Tuesday morning. He left for work around 7. "That was the day of the crash?" "Yes." "Did he say where he was going?" "He had meetings." "What kind of meetings?" "I don't know. Richard didn't discuss the company with me." Thomas glanced at her. Walter noticed. Daniel turned to him. Thomas? I saw him Monday evening at the main office. Did you speak? Briefly. About what? Work. Helen gave a short, bitter laugh. Thomas looked at her. What? You were shouting loud enough for half the building to hear. Daniel's eyes moved between them. What was the argument about? Thomas placed both hands on the back of a chair. Richard accused me of approving invoices without checking them. Had you? I managed daily operations. I signed dozens of invoices. Did he threaten to fire you? Thomas hesitated. Yes. Laura finally looked up. He also threatened to call the police. Thomas turned toward her. You weren't there. I heard him say it later. When? Monday night, he came to see me. Helen stared at her daughter. You told me you hadn't spoken to your father in weeks. Laura's expression hardened. I lied. Why? Because every time I spoke to him, you wanted to know what he said about you. Helen looked away. Daniel asked Laura, what did Richard want? He said something was wrong at the company. Money was missing. He thought someone had been stealing from him. Did he name anyone? No. Did he seem afraid? Laura considered the question. Yes. Of Thomas? No. He said it was someone who should have been gone a long time ago. Walter had been standing against the wall. Now he spoke. Those exact words. Laura nodded. Someone who should have been gone a long time ago. Margaret Bell tightened her grip on her purse. Walter saw it. He walked toward her. Mrs. Bell, what did that mean? The old woman looked at him. I don't know. You reacted. I reacted because my son is missing and another man is dead. Walter pulled out the chair across from her. 20 years ago, your husband disappeared. The room became still. Daniel glanced at Walter but did not interrupt. George Bell had vanished in 2006. His empty car had been found beside the Grey River. A torn coat had been recovered downstream. No body was ever found. At the time, Walter had been a detective with the Greyford Police Department. It had been his case. Margaret spoke carefully. My husband died. We never proved that. You found his coat. We found a coat. Helen shook her head. What does George have to do with this? Walter watched Margaret. That's what I'd like to know. Margaret stood. My husband has been dead for 20 years. Richard is alive somewhere. Find him. She left the room. Walter remained seated. Daniel waited until the door closed. You think George Bell is alive? I thought it 20 years ago. Why? Because dead men usually leave something behind. He left a car and a coat. He also emptied 3 bank accounts 2 days before he disappeared. Thomas stared at Walter. That was never made public. No, Helen asked. Then why wasn't he charged? Because stealing your own money isn't a crime, and disappearing isn't murder. Walter looked toward the closed door. But sometimes people disappear because staying would reveal something worse. Emily Carter was waiting outside Greyford Community Bank when Walter and Daniel arrived. Emily was 34, worked for the Greyford Chronicle, and had a talent for appearing wherever the sheriff did not want her to be. Her dark coat was already wet from the rain. She held a notebook beneath one arm. Sheriff Cole. No, I haven't asked anything. Save us both time. Emily looked at Walter. Mr. Hayes? No, you're both very predictable. Daniel pointed toward the sidewalk. This is an active investigation. And the wrong man was nearly buried in front of 60 witnesses. It's already active news. Walter paused beside her. What have you heard? Daniel looked at him. Walter. Emily smiled. That Richard Bell withdrew $20,000 this morning. Daniel's face changed. That information wasn't released. No, it was shouted by a bank employee while 3 customers were standing nearby. Walter said, "Anything else?" The camera footage is unclear. Richard was wearing a baseball cap and dark glasses. Could you identify him? Not from the face. Daniel opened the bank door. Emily called after them. But I could identify his jacket. Walter stopped. What about it? Richard wore it in a photograph taken at a charity event last winter. Brown leather, dark collar, tear near the left pocket. Daniel turned. You have that photograph? Of course. Send it to me. Emily smiled again. Now I'm useful. You're still outside. The bank manager showed them the ATM recording. At 6:43 in the morning, a man entered the small lobby. He wore a cap pulled low, dark glasses, and a brown leather jacket. He inserted Richard Bell's company card, entered the code, withdrew $5,000. Then repeated the transaction 3 more times from different linked accounts. The footage lasted less than 3 minutes. Daniel paused the video. Height matches. Approximately, Walter said. Build matches. Approximately. The clothes are Richard's. Definitely. Daniel looked at him. But? Walter replayed the footage. The man entered the PIN, then pressed the confirmation button. Walter paused the image. He's using his left hand. Daniel shrugged. So? Richard Bell was right-handed. How do you know? I interviewed him when his father disappeared. He signed a statement in front of me. Daniel replayed the video. Every action was performed with the left hand. The card, the keypad, the money, the door. Daniel leaned back. Thomas is left-handed. Walter nodded. The dead man is wearing Richard's ring. The man at the bank is wearing Richard's clothes. Somebody is building Richard Bell out of spare parts. The bank manager shifted uncomfortably. Should I be hearing this? No, Daniel said. Walter studied the frozen image. Thomas didn't just withdraw the money, he wanted the camera to see him. How can you tell? He looked directly at it twice. So Thomas staged the footage. Perhaps. Why? Walter closed the laptop. Let's ask him. Thomas Bell lasted 40 seconds. Daniel placed a printed image from the ATM camera on the interview room table. Thomas looked at it, then at Walter, then at the floor. Daniel said, "You withdrew $20,000 using Richard's card." Thomas did not answer. "You wore his clothes." Silence. "You made sure the camera saw you." Thomas pressed his palms against his forehead. "He told me to do it." "Richard?" "Yes." "When?" "Monday night." "What exactly did he ask you to do?" Thomas breathed deeply. "He said someone was going to kill him." "And you believed him?" "At first, no. Then he showed me the accounts." "What accounts?" Money had been disappearing from Bell Transportation. Not small amounts, hundreds of thousands over several years. Who was taking it? He didn't know, but he suspected you. Thomas looked at Daniel sharply. He suspected everyone. Walter asked, "Why stage the ATM withdrawal?" Thomas looked toward him. Richard planned to disappear. Daniel sat back. "Start at the beginning." Thomas stared at the photograph. "He said he was going to fake an accident. The car would burn. People would think he was dead." "And the body?" Thomas shook his head. "There wasn't supposed to be a body." Walter and Daniel exchanged a glance. Thomas continued. "He planned to leave the car near the old county bridge and set it on fire. Then I was supposed to use his card on the morning of the funeral. The footage would prove he was alive after the crash." "Why?" "So the insurance company wouldn't pay Helen, so the police would investigate his disappearance." He wanted whoever was stealing from the business to panic. Where is Richard now? I don't know. When did you last speak to him? Tuesday afternoon, a few hours before the crash. What did he say? That everything was ready. And you still went through with the ATM withdrawal after a body was found? Thomas swallowed. That was the plan. The plan changed when someone died. I was afraid. Of Richard? Thomas looked directly at Walter. No. Then who? Thomas's voice dropped. My father. The medical examiner identified the body that afternoon. Mark Lewis, 46 years old, chief mechanic at Bell Transportation. He had worked for the company for 14 years. Mark lived alone in a small apartment above a hardware store. He had no wife, no children, and no close relatives in Greyford. According to his employer, he had not reported for work since Tuesday. The same day, Richard Bell's car burned. Daniel and Walter searched Mark's apartment. Nothing appeared disturbed. The bed had not been slept in. A half-eaten sandwich remained in the refrigerator. Work boots stood beside the door. Walter opened a kitchen cabinet and found an empty bottle of expensive bourbon. Daniel examined a stack of bills. No signs he was planning to disappear. Walter opened a drawer. Inside were 2 envelopes containing cash. $11,000 in total. Daniel looked over his shoulder. That's a lot for a mechanic, especially one with unpaid electricity bills. They found Mark's phone beneath the sofa. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. There were 7 missed calls from Richard Bell. The final call had been made at 7:12 in the evening on Tuesday, less than an hour before the crash was reported. There was also an unsent audio recording. Daniel played it. Mark Lewis's frightened voice filled the room. Richard found out who took the money. He says it happened before, just like with his father. I told him I want nothing more to do with this. If something happens to me... The recording ended. Walter listened again. What was he doing while he recorded it? Daniel frowned. What do you mean? There's a sound in the background. They replayed the message. Beneath Mark's voice was a low, mechanical rhythm. A metallic clank every 4 seconds. Daniel said, "Industrial equipment?" Walter listened once more. A loading dock. Bell Transportation operated 3 warehouses. Only one still used the old hydraulic loading system that produced a repeating metal strike. Warehouse 3. It stood outside Greyford, near the abandoned freight terminal, the same area where George Bell had once built the company's first storage yard. Mark Lewis had not died in the car fire. The medical examiner found a fracture at the back of his skull, and evidence that he had died before the vehicle burned. The killer had placed Mark's body in Richard's car, then dressed him with Richard's personal belongings. But one question remained. If Richard had planned an empty car fire, who had added the body? Daniel believed the answer was obvious. Richard killed Mark. Walter did not respond. They planned the fake accident together, Daniel continued. Mark helped prepare the car, then something happened. Richard killed him and used the body. Possible. You say that when you disagree. I say that when something is possible. What isn't convincing you? Richard wanted the police to learn he was alive. That was the purpose of the ATM footage. So placing a body in the car made the plan more complicated. He panicked after killing Mark. Perhaps. Daniel exhaled. There's that word again. Walter looked through the windshield toward Warehouse 3. They had parked across the road. The building appeared empty. Rust covered the loading doors. Weeds pushed through the cracked pavement. Walter opened his car door. Let's see what Mark was afraid of. The side entrance had been forced recently. Inside, the warehouse smelled of oil, wet wood, and old dust. Rows of empty shelves disappeared into darkness. Daniel switched on his flashlight. The hydraulic loading mechanism remained near the rear wall. Every few seconds, pressure escaped from an old valve. Clank. Pause. Clank. The exact sound from Mark's recording. Walter walked slowly across the floor. Near the loading platform, he found dried blood between two concrete seams. Daniel crouched beside it. Mark was killed here. Walter pointed toward a drag mark leading to the vehicle bay, and moved afterward. They found a discarded roll of plastic sheeting, burned fabric, a broken pair of eyeglasses. Daniel picked them up. Richard wore glasses. He couldn't drive without them. So he was here. Walter examined the frames. One lens was missing. The right arm was bent outward. There was blood on the nose bridge. Daniel stood. Richard killed Mark here. Mark struck him during the struggle. Richard lost his glasses. Walter moved his flashlight across the floor. You're arranging the evidence in the order you expect. And you aren't? No, I'm trying not to. At the far end of the warehouse, they found an office. The desk had been searched. Drawers were open. Papers covered the floor. Someone had removed the computer's hard drive. Walter noticed a rectangular area of clean dust on the wall. Something had recently hung there. What was removed? Daniel asked. Walter looked at the marks. A framed photograph or a certificate. Why take that? Because it showed someone. Outside the office, a vehicle approached. Daniel drew his weapon. Headlights swept across the warehouse windows. A car stopped near the side entrance. The door opened. Emily Carter stepped inside. Daniel lowered his gun. What are you doing here? Reporting. You could have been shot. You could try saying hello first. Walter looked past her. How did you find this place? Emily held up an old newspaper clipping. I was researching George Bell. The article contained a photograph taken at the opening of Warehouse 3 in 1998. George Bell stood beside two employees. One was a much younger Richard. The other was a thin man with a long face and white hair. Walter took the clipping. Who is he? Earl Warren, George Bell's accountant. Daniel said, he died years ago. No, Emily replied. He moved away after George disappeared. At least, that's what the newspaper said. Walter studied the photograph. Did you find an obituary? No. A death record? No. Daniel looked at him. You think Warren came back? I think someone removed this photograph from the office because one of the men in it mattered. Emily opened her notebook. I also found something else. George Bell's disappearance wasn't the first suspicious event connected to the company. She handed Walter another clipping. In 2001, a Bell transportation driver named Samuel Price had died when his truck went off the road. The company had blamed mechanical failure. Mark Lewis had inspected the vehicle. At the time, Mark was 21 years old and newly employed. Walter read the final paragraph. The damaged truck had been carrying no official cargo, but several witnesses reported seeing sealed containers removed from the scene before police arrived. Daniel said, Smuggling? Maybe, Emily replied. Walter folded the article. Or money. The warehouse lights suddenly went out. The hydraulic mechanism stopped. A silence filled the building. Then a metal door slammed somewhere in the darkness. Daniel raised his weapon. Sheriff's Department. Footsteps ran toward the rear exit. Daniel chased them. Walter moved more slowly, following the sound. A shadow crossed the vehicle bay. The rear door opened. Rain blew inside. By the time Daniel reached the yard, a dark sedan was already disappearing down the access road. Emily joined them. "Did you see the driver?" Daniel shook his head. Walter looked down. Something lay in the mud. A silver button. He picked it up. Engraved on its surface were the letters GB. Margaret Bell refused to speak with Daniel. She agreed to speak with Walter. They sat in her living room that evening. The house was filled with photographs. Richard as a child. Thomas at school. George Bell standing beside his first truck. In every picture, George wore a dark suit with silver buttons. The initials GB were engraved on each one. Walter placed the button on the table. Margaret stared at it. "Where did you find this?" "Warehouse 3. She said nothing. "Your husband is alive." Margaret looked toward the window. Walter waited. Finally, she spoke. "I received a letter 6 months ago." "From George?" "Yes." "What did it say?" "That he wanted to come home." "Did you answer?" "No." "But you met him." Her eyes filled with tears. "Once." "Where?" "At a motel outside the county." "What did he want?" "Money." "For what?" "He said someone had found him. He said he needed to disappear again." "Who found him?" "He wouldn't tell me." "Did Richard know?" "Not then." "When did Richard find out?" 3 weeks ago, he saw George leaving my house." Walter leaned forward. "George was here?" "He came after I stopped answering his calls." "What did Richard do?" "He followed him." "Where?" "I don't know." Margaret stood and walked to the fireplace. "He came back late that night. He was furious. He said his father had destroyed this family once and would not do it again." "What had George done?" Margaret faced him. "You already know." "I suspected financial fraud. I couldn't prove it." "It was more than fraud." Walter remained silent. Margaret's voice became unsteady. "George used the company to move stolen goods, machinery, electronics, sometimes weapons. Richard found records. He threatened to go to the police. So George disappeared. Yes. He staged his death. Yes. Did Richard help him?" Margaret began to cry. "No, but he let people believe George was dead because he wanted to protect the company, and because he wanted to protect me." "Where is George now?" "I don't know." "Mrs. Bell, a man has been murdered." "I don't know." Walter stood. At the door, Margaret spoke again. "Mr. Hayes." He turned. Richard hated his father, but he also spent his whole life becoming him. Laura Bell had been hiding something. Walter found her at the Greyford Chronicle office with Emily. She had brought a flash drive. Richard had given it to her during their secret meeting 2 days before the crash. "He told me not to open it unless he disappeared," Laura said. "Why didn't you give it to the sheriff?" Walter asked. "Because my father said the police might arrest the wrong person." Daniel, standing near the door, did not appear amused. The flash drive contained copies of Bell transportation accounts. Payments had been routed through repair companies that did not exist. Nearly $400,000 had vanished over 6 years. The transactions had been approved through Richard's executive account, Helen's personal account, and Thomas's management authorization. Daniel looked at Laura. "Your father suspected the whole family?" "He said the records were being manipulated." Emily scrolled through the files. Here, a company named Warren Logistics had received monthly payments. The registered owner was Edward Grant. Walter searched the address. It belonged to an assisted living facility in Arkansas. Edward Grant was 78 years old. The photograph on his state record showed a thin face and white hair. It was Earl Warren, George Bell's former accountant. Walter said, "George wasn't stealing alone." Daniel pointed toward the screen. "Warren used Richard's company accounts." and someone inside Bell Transportation approved the payments. Thomas? Or Richard? Laura shook her head. My father was trying to stop it. Your father planned to burn his car and disappear, Daniel said. That isn't usually what innocent people do. Laura looked at Walter. He said he had to make George believe he was dead. Why? So George would come out of hiding. Walter understood. Richard had not planned his fake death merely to escape. It had been bait. He knew George would return to Greyford once he believed Richard could no longer expose him. The ATM footage would later prove Richard was alive. Richard intended to watch George, gather evidence, and return as the man who had uncovered everything. But Mark Lewis had become part of the plan, and now Mark was dead. Daniel's phone rang. A deputy had located the dark sedan seen near Warehouse 3. It had been abandoned near the old freight terminal. Inside, police found blood, a map of Greyford, and Richard Bell's missing eyeglass lens. The old Greyford freight terminal had closed 17 years earlier. Half of the roof had collapsed. Freight cars sat rusting on unused tracks. Daniel arrived with 4 deputies. Walter came separately. They searched the main building first. Nothing. Then a deputy found fresh tire tracks leading toward a maintenance shed behind the rail yard. The door was locked. Daniel called out, "Richard Bell, Sheriff's Department." No answer. He forced the door. The smell reached them first. Blood, oil, gunpowder. Richard Bell sat on the floor against the rear wall. He was alive. His face was bruised. His shirt was torn. A cut ran above his right eye. 10 feet away lay an elderly man in a dark suit. George Bell. A pistol rested beside his right hand. Richard raised both hands. "Don't shoot." Daniel approached carefully. "Where is your weapon?" "I don't have one." "What happened?" Richard looked at the body. "He tried to kill me." Walter entered behind Daniel. Richard saw him. For a moment, something like recognition passed through his face. "You." Walter nodded. "We met 20 years ago." Richard laughed weakly. "You told my mother my father might still be alive." "I was right." Daniel checked George's pulse. "He's dead." Richard closed his eyes. "I didn't want this." "Tell me what happened." Richard spoke slowly. He had discovered the fraudulent payments months earlier. At first, he suspected Thomas. Then, Mark Lewis showed him old maintenance invoices that matched the same system used during George's criminal operation 20 years ago. Mark admitted that George and Earl Warren had contacted him. They wanted access to Bell Transportation's current accounts. Mark helped them in exchange for money. When Richard confronted Mark, the mechanic agreed to help expose them. Together, they planned the staged crash. Richard would disappear. Mark would set fire to the empty car. Thomas would appear at the ATM wearing Richard's clothes. Once George believed Richard was dead, he would return to collect records hidden at Warehouse 3. But according to Richard, George discovered the plan. He killed Mark, placed Mark's body in the car, then kidnapped Richard. Richard claimed he escaped and followed George to the freight terminal. They fought. George reached for a gun. Richard shot him in self-defense. Daniel looked toward the pistol. Whose gun? His. How did you shoot him if he had it? I took it during the struggle. And then placed it beside him? I dropped it. Walter walked toward George's body. The bullet had entered the center of the chest. One shot. Accurate. Controlled. George's right hand was open near the weapon. Walter looked at the fingers, then at Richard. Your father injured his right hand in 1999. Richard's face did not change. Walter continued. 3 fingers were crushed beneath a trailer coupling. He never regained full movement. Daniel looked at the dead man's hand. Walter said he couldn't properly grip a pistol with it. Richard swallowed. He used both hands. No. Walter crouched beside the body. The gun was fired from several feet away. There are no powder marks on his sleeves, no signs of a struggle near the weapon. Richard looked toward Daniel. You believe him? Daniel did not answer. Walter stood. You placed the pistol beside your father's right hand because most people are right-handed. Richard's voice became sharper. He was trying to kill me. Perhaps he was, but not in the way you described. You weren't here. No. But your glasses were found in the abandoned car. The right arm was bent outward. There was blood on the bridge. So? Someone struck you from the front. Richard said nothing. Mark struck you at Warehouse 3. That's a guess. Mark recorded a message shortly before his death. He said you had discovered who took the money. Then the recording ended. He was afraid of George. He was afraid of you. Richard began to stand. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. Stay down. Walter continued. Mark wanted more money. $11,000 was found in his apartment. He had already been paid, but it wasn't enough. Richard looked at Walter with cold, steady eyes. You can't prove that. You argued. Mark hit you. You struck him with something heavy. Daniel said. The fracture at the back of his skull. Walter nodded. You had a body and a plan requiring a burned car, so you changed the plan. Richard's breathing became slower. You dressed Mark in your suit, put your ring and watch on him, placed him in the car. Daniel added, then Thomas created the footage showing you alive. Walter said, that gave you the perfect contradiction. A dead Richard Bell in the car and a living Richard Bell at the bank. Richard looked down. You expected the police to conclude the body had been misidentified. You would remain missing while everyone searched for George. Laura appeared in the doorway behind the deputies. She had followed the police vehicles. Richard saw her. Laura, go home. She stared at him. Did you kill Mark? No. Walter looked at the dead man. You found George after the fire. You intended to make him responsible for everything. Richard's expression hardened. He was responsible. For the fraud, perhaps. For all of it. Not for Mark Lewis. Richard looked at Walter. You don't know what he did to this family. I know what you did. Silence filled the shed. Rain struck the metal roof. Walter stepped closer. You wanted to return as a victim. The son who survived an attack by the father everyone believed was dead. George would be blamed for the stolen money, Mark's murder, the burned car, and your disappearance. Richard said quietly, he deserved it. So did Mark? Richard looked at Laura. He was blackmailing me. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Daniel's face changed. Walter said nothing. Richard closed his eyes. Laura whispered, you killed him. Richard looked at her. He ruined everything. No, Walter said. He complicated it. Richard's eyes moved toward him. That was enough. Daniel took out his handcuffs. Richard Bell, you are under arrest for the murder of Mark Lewis and George Bell. Richard did not resist. As Daniel pulled him to his feet, Richard looked at Walter. You think you solved this? Walter answered. I think 2 men are dead, and you're still trying to decide which one matters. The investigation continued for 3 weeks. Earl Warren was arrested in Arkansas. He admitted helping George Bell create the fraudulent companies but denied knowing about the murders. Thomas Bell was charged with unlawful access to company funds and assisting in the staged disappearance. Because he cooperated with investigators, prosecutors did not charge him with murder. Helen Bell learned that Richard had changed his will. The insurance policy would not be paid. Bell Transportation entered bankruptcy proceedings. Margaret Bell buried George in a private ceremony attended by 6 people. Mark Lewis received a separate funeral. This time, the name on the coffin was correct. Emily Carter's article appeared on the front page of the Greyford Chronicle. The headline read, "Greyford buried the wrong man while the real killer watched." Walter read it over breakfast at Martha Reed's cafe. Martha placed a cup of coffee in front of him. "You're in the newspaper again. I noticed. You look unhappy." Newspapers rarely improve a person's morning. Martha glanced at the article. "You solved it. Daniel solved it. You helped." Walter looked through the window. Across the street, people were opening shops. A delivery truck stopped beside the pharmacy. The town was returning to normal. "You know what always bothered me about Richard," Walter said. Martha waited. "He didn't run." "What do you mean?" "He had money. A false identity could have been arranged. He could have disappeared. But he wanted to come back." Walter nodded. He wanted everyone to know he had won. Martha refilled his coffee. "That sounds lonely." "It usually is." Later that afternoon, Walter met Daniel at the cemetery. Richard Bell's grave had never been used. The headstone had already been installed before the funeral. Richard Edward Bell, 1968 to 2026. Devoted husband, father, and son. A cemetery worker was removing it. Daniel stood beside Walter. "When did you know Richard was alive?" "I didn't." "You suspected him before we found him." "I suspected everyone." "That isn't an answer." Walter watched the worker loosen the stone. Richard's funeral was too carefully arranged. His family arranged it. He chose the suit sent to the funeral home. He left instructions about the closed coffin. He made sure the car contained his belongings. He asked Thomas to appear at the bank. Daniel nodded. He controlled everything. Dead men don't usually arrange their own funerals so carefully. The worker lifted the stone onto a small cart. As he passed, he looked at the engraved name. "Wrong name," he muttered. Then he glanced at the empty grave. Wrong grave. He pushed the cart toward the cemetery road. Daniel looked at Walter. "You coming?" Walter remained beside the grave for another moment. The rain had stopped. Water gathered at the bottom of the empty hole, reflecting the gray Missouri sky. Walter closed his notebook. "Wrong man," he said. Then he followed Daniel out of the cemetery.